AnnaMarie Bena, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. And I'm excited to host this webinar, this Afghan policy update, to provide an update on Afghan-related policy and immigration legal issues. It's been almost 2 years since the first Afghans were evacuated and brought to U.S. military bases. And USCRI has been involved on Afghan issues and assisting Afghans throughout these past 2 years. We provided medical and mental health services at the military bases. We worked with unaccompanied Afghan minors, and we've resettled over 10,000 Afghans. And we're continuing to provide mental health and social services. Most recently, we have been focusing on immigration legal services. And that's because so many Afghans came into the country under humanitarian parole. And of course, parole is temporary, which means Afghans have been living in an immigration limbo. So for today's webinar, we're going to cover 3 areas that intersect and overlap and may provide some immigration protection, some probably still temporary, but some immigration protection for Afghans. We're going to talk about the Afghan Adjustment Act, or the AAA, re-parole, and temporary protected status, or TPS. And I have with me Jacob Mantey, who is USCRI's Legal Services Coordinator. He oversees the USCRI Partner Network of Attorneys. And we have about 20 or so legal partner agencies. Some of you may be with those agencies, and those agencies are providing legal services for Afghans. Jacob also works on ILSA, USCRI's program funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement that provides legal services to Afghans across the country. I also have Daniel Salazar, who is the USCRI policy analyst, focusing on all issues related to Afghans. And if I want to get any sort of update on legislation having to do with Afghans, Daniel is the person I go to. And he's also focused on their resettlement here in the US. And before I jump in, I just want to do a side note that we're going to go through. I'm going to be doing some questions, asking Daniel and Jacob those questions, and they'll be answering. And while we're going through the presentation, if something comes to you that you'd like to ask, please put it into the question and answer section. And after we go through the presentations, I'll come back to those questions and answers, and we'll have time at the end to go through them. So I want to start with Daniel. So Daniel, the first question, to really ground us and get folks focused on what we're talking about, could you tell everyone what is the Afghan Adjustment Act and what is this bill trying to address?
Thank you, AnnaMarie. The Afghan Adjustment Act is a bill, a legislative proposal in Congress to address the legal limbo that comes about from the use of humanitarian parole. As you mentioned, the majority of Afghans who arrived in the United States in 2021 were granted parole for their entry and admission into the United States. But as you mentioned, it's temporary. It does not directly connect to a pathway to lawful permanent residency in this country. And so through ILSA, through other mechanisms, Afghans have been pursuing immigration relief through a variety of different statuses, whether it's asylum or special immigrant visa adjustment of status. More temporary measures such as re-parole or temporary protected status, which we'll talk about a bit later. But the AAA specifically is modeled to establish a streamlined adjustment of status process for Afghans to apply for lawful permanent residency, to get on the path to getting a green card in the US. There would be screening, there would be an in-person interview, but it would allow Afghan parolees to secure that permanent status in a streamlined manner, rather than this kind of hodgepodge of different efforts, as well as temporary statuses which have to be renewed. The AAA does have a bunch of other non-adjustment related provisions that are important. It would make changes to the special immigrant visa or SIV program. So more Afghan allies are eligible for that program due to their combat experience alongside US and coalition troops. It would establish an office in lieu of an embassy. to help with consular processing. It would create an interagency task force on Afghan ally resettlement. And it would also it also has a variety of language related to reporting and accountability and responses to congressional inquiries. So it's a tightly written bill, but it covers a lot of ground in the Afghan resettlement space and trying to enhance protections for Afghans here, as well as those who remain overseas.
Thank you for that. So the question I think everybody has is, where does the AAA stand in this Congress?
Yes, so it's been reintroduced in both chambers of the U.S. Congress, and the goal has been currently is to pass it this session. It's a sometimes bills are for messaging or for a platform to draw attention to an issue, but really this is a bill that its sponsors and co-sponsors and supporters want passed expeditiously, and we're doing everything we can to make sure it does receive attention this session. The question is, how does one do that, right? Bills can be passed on their own as a standalone, which does happen, but it's pretty difficult for all the reasons that are evident with Congress as an institution in 2023. But AAA strategy right now is there a must-pass bill that AAA can be attached to, a legislative vehicle that it can be added to? So in that context, like to wind back a bit, AAA was first introduced last August, about a year ago, and in the previous Congress. And so there was an opportunity to pass it along with the omnibus in December, which the omnibus is Congress's end of the year spending package that has to be be approved before the end of the year. It wasn't passed, and so that was really a missed opportunity for Congress to resolve this issue. And so now, like, a lot of the first half of the year was basically getting the bill text in the best possible shape. And then from there, the AAA was reintroduced by a bipartisan bicameral group of lawmakers on July 13th. It's SR 2327 in the Senate, and it's HR 4627 in the House. In terms of right now, like, the current push is to get the bill attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, also known as the NDAA. This is the annual defense and national security bill before Congress. And so we believe that the NDAA is not only timely, but it's topically relevant when a lot of the NDAA concerns the military and national security concerns. And this has been a bill that long has the support of veterans, as well as a national security angle when we talk about supporting our Afghan allies and what that means for American strategy moving forward.
So it's been reintroduced, filed in both the House and the Senate. What's next as we look past the August recess?
Yeah, so that's the key kind of development in the last week or two. So both chambers have their own version of the NDAA before they went on August recess recently. The AAA currently is in neither the House or the Senate version of the NDAA. But there is another opportunity, a window of opportunity for the AAA, which is that the bills between the two versions have to be resolved during the conference process between the House and the Senate. We are pushing for the AAA to be included as part of that process, particularly on the Senate side, to basically encourage the conferees and negotiators to include the AAA moving forward in its negotiations between the two chambers. Because right now there's kind of a wide difference between the NDAA in the House and the NDAA in the Senate. So the conference process is our current focus to make sure that the AAA is attached on the Senate side, on the House side, whichever side it is. Our priority is the Senate, but getting it attached and then having it be included in the conference process moving forward. We're in a strong place in the Senate. Right now the bill has 12 co-sponsors, sponsors and co-sponsors in the Senate, evenly split between the parties. And to be clear, that's not just who would vote for it if it came up. That is 11 champions who have their names on the bill, plus the original sponsor, Senator Klobuchar. And in the House, it's also in a strong position when we have roughly 30 sponsors and co-sponsors led by Representative Miller Meeks of Iowa. So We'll be candid. We wish it was included in the omnibus last year. We wish it was included in the NDAA a couple of weeks ago. But this bill still has an incredible amount of support and a path forward if we continue to advocate for it.
So Daniel, I think that you just answered one of the questions that we have in the chat, which is how broad is the AAA's congressional sponsorship at this time? I don't know if you want to review those numbers that you just gave about the, okay, thanks.
I can check on that after and confirm during the Q&A.
Confirm the numbers. Okay, great. All right, so I'll keep going. I understand that there is a competing bill to the AAA in Congress. Can you explain the differences relevant to this discussion?
Sure. It's become a relevant topic in the last 3 or 4 weeks. Senator Cotton of Arkansas introduced a bill also related to Afghan allies, also on the same day, on July 13th. It is encouraging to see any member of Congress, care about this issue, be active on it. And some of the provision also closely mirror the original AAA as well. So it has the interagency task force. It has the office in lieu of an embassy. That said, there are concerns about it. So there's a section of the bill that would basically designate at-risk Afghan allies as a priority 2 designation under the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, which we have concerns about because anyone who maybe has followed Afghan resettlement issues and relocation issues over the last 2 years, P2 has not been a effective pathway for Afghans to seek resettlement to the United States, particularly vis-a-vis consular issues in Pakistan. There's also another part of the bill, Section 8, that has to do with parole authority, the parole authority in immigration law that allow the administration to use parole in its Afghan response and frankly in its response to other displacement. There's provisions that would basically tweak and edit and roll back some of that parole authority. And to be clear, there should be, it's fair game to talk about parole authority, how parole is used, as resettlement, folks, we care about, permanent pathways. There shouldn't be an overuse of parole. Like those are all fair, but we feel that conversation doesn't belong tied to this narrow issue of Afghans. So at the end of the day, the AAA is the one that has gotten the momentum over the last 11 and a half months because it was previously introduced. It's also the one that does have broad bipartisan support. As I mentioned, 12 sponsors and co-sponsors in the Senate. I would need to confirm the exact number in the House, but it's close to 30. It has the support of veterans groups. So if there is going to be a bill on this topic that gets traction and attention this session, it should be the bipartisan version introduced by Senator Klobuchar in the Senate and Representative Miller Meeks in the House.
All right. So Daniel, you have quite a number of questions. Everyone definitely is curious about the AAA. For folks who have put in questions into the question and answers, I'm going to circle back to them at the end, and they will probably be grouped by the topic. I know one that people are thinking about is that if they care about the AAA and how you've described this, what should people do?
Absolutely. So I'd encourage people to reach out to their representatives and Senate offices via call, email, et cetera, to tell them why the AAA should be passed as soon as possible, including through the National Defense Authorization Act and the NDAA conference reconciliation process specifically. If you're on social media, to post and share about your support for the AAA. I will say, having doing these meetings, sometimes offices feel that they can't lead or join onto bills because they don't feel that there is constituent support or interests. And really, like, now is the time, in terms of the August recess of members back in their home districts and states, is to show them that support, is to show that support is there. If you are part of USCRI's resettlement network and want to meet with congressional staff members, please reach out to me. We're happy to set up meetings and meet with staff members to elevate what you see as a caseworker, as an attorney, I will say that, you know, folks who want to advocate on this, you don't have to know every nook and cranny of the bill. What matters is, you know, that you're comfortable sharing your experiences and why it matters to you, your clients, to your family, to relatives back in Afghanistan or Pakistan. And ultimately, staffers want to hear from you specifically, and it does have an effect. You know, we've had meetings with congressional offices who've later signed on as co-sponsors, and I hear all the time others who make inroads with these meetings. So one call, one tweet, one post, one email isn't going to do it, but it's this collective kind of response moving forward that creates that outreach. And so I'd encourage people to take those steps, particularly with those who haven't already endorsed the bill. And I will share in both the Q&A, hopefully, as well as our follow-up materials, the where people can find the list of co-sponsors. So you're, you know, thanking the right people or thanking the correct officials who've already signed on, or encouraging those who haven't to do so.
Thanks, Daniel. And so as I turn to Jacob, if you could pop in the bill numbers, the Senate and the House version, Daniel, that would be good. And I will turn to Jacob Mantey, who is USCRI's Legal Services Network Coordinator. And I mentioned him earlier. He is based in Albany, New York. And we're going to focus a lot on parole here. So Jacob, what is parole for Afghans?
Thanks so much for the introduction. Before I turn to the questions, I just want to give a brief disclaimer that what we're talking about today is for educational and background purposes only. Our intent is for this webinar to provide people a sense of the nuances of updated law and policy and how we and our advocacy partners are working within them. It is not intended to provide legal advice or advice on pursuing protection inside the United States. This informational session is limited to the Afghan Adjustment Act, free parole, and temporary protection status. Turning to your question now, parole is a strange concept. It's kind of a legal fiction. The government says, hey, we want to let you in the country, but we're not formally admitting you to stay here. So one form of parole comes from a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act 212D5. That's humanitarian parole. So humanitarian parole comes with refugee resettlement assistance as given by ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Folks who benefit from receiving humanitarian parole can be served by resettlement agencies like USCRI and our partners, and receive certain forms of public assistance. So when the US evacuated Afghans in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they were all given humanitarian parole under Section 212D5 of the INA for an initial parole period of about 2 years. So it allows for temporary residence in the United States, and it comes with work authorization. And those who are humanitarian parolees may work and obtain an employment authorization document and work with resettlement agencies on obtaining self-sufficiency inside the United States.
So I feel like re-parole is just becoming one of those terms that you just hear and it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? So could you explain what is re-parole and why is it necessary?
Re-parole can take two different forms that we'll discuss. Re-parole is an application or a sua sponte review by the government for eligible Afghans to receive another period of humanitarian parole in the United States beyond the 2 years that they were initially given in the evacuation. 2 years wasn't enough time for Afghans to obtain permanent relief. Not all have filed. Not all who have filed have received a decision. So that means they're languishing in this temporary state, and some of their paroles are set to expire as early as this month. So in order for us to continue services through ORR, and in order for Afghans to maintain lawful status in the country, re-parole is necessary. It's also necessary because if their status does expire, while they're waiting for their claims to be adjudicated, they will start accruing unlawful presence, which comes with its own baggage of concerns.
So who has been affirmatively applying for it?
Yeah, so by affirmatively applying, we mean in the way, not in the way that immigration practitioners typically distinguish between the affirmative and defensive process, where people might be using re-parole as a defense and removal proceedings, but we mean more where folks are applying with Form I-131 application for travel authorization rather than benefiting from the government's sua sponte review. So there are two distinct processes for re-parole here. This affirmative process, we can shorthand it as affirmative process, is for those who have no claims pending. So only have maybe temporary protected status, they should be applying affirmatively using Form I-131. If you're in the early stages of the special immigrant visa process, then those folks are also going to want to use the Form I-131 to affirmatively apply. And of course, those who have no applications pending would want to be applying.
Okay, so you let us know some of the people who should be applying, but we know some Afghan parolees do not have to apply for re-parole. Can you discuss who that is and what they're supposed to do next or be on the lookout for?
Absolutely. So this is the sua sponte review that I had mentioned earlier. USCIS communicated to stakeholders and Afghans that those who have already applied for either asylum or adjustment of status using forms I-589 or Form I-485 do not need to apply on their own initiative. USCIS will, on their own initiative, review those pending applications on a case-by-case basis and automatically issue a decision on whether to issue the applicant and their derivatives a re-parole extension. And if approved, that notice of decision will come to the applicant's last known address with USCIS and will contain an extension of their work authorization and come with an additional 2-year period of humanitarian parole.
Okay, so that seems a little bit stressful, Jacob, because you're just kind of waiting to see if something's going to come in the mail. So where do things stand now with re-parole? What does the short to medium term look like for re-parole?
Right now, we're starting to see our first decisions, but mostly we're in a wait and see period, like you said. We continue to advocate for notices that the auto review process is underway, be sent to beneficiaries to ease anxiety and concern, to let people know that this is happening, because when the only thing that we can say to an Afghan parolees is that USCIS has told us that this is happening, that rings rather hollow. So we continue to advocate for our clients, and unfortunately, a lot of what we're doing now is waiting and seeing.
Okay, so I think this just happened yesterday. I think that the Office of Refugee Resettlement announced a continuation of benefits for Afghan parolees. Is that right?
That's correct. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement issued an updated policy letter 2211 on August 1st. And this is a most welcome announcement for us because prior to this, services would have abruptly stopped upon the expiration of a client's parole status. But with this memo, as long as they've been our client and receiving services prior to the expiration of their parole status and have had forms of relief pending before the expiration of their parole status, we may continue to serve our clients.
Okay, and along with a lot of other links and information that we're going to put into the chat, we will definitely put a link to the Office of Refugee Resettlement most recent policy letter that Jacob just explained. So earlier this year, before re-parole was announced, I know TPS was a popular option for some legal service providers to secure immigration relief for their Afghan clients. Why is that?
That's a litigation strategy. A lot of attorneys assisting this particular population were filing for TPS in this past fall because TPS was typically adjudicated faster than asylum applications and adjustment of status applications, as well as those SIV processing times. Those were much longer as well. So the hope was obtain temporary protected status to keep people from being placed in deportation proceedings and keep people from being detained if the reparole application fell through. This was before the Department of Homeland Security announced that they would open a pathway for reparoling Afghans, and to make sure that they have continued lawful status in the United States. It's no longer really the case that we're doing TPS as this type of strategy because the designation period the designation period is set to expire before the parole would be continued through. We'll talk a little bit about that more in our next section there.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. And I do think that's getting a little bit more complicated as far as the TPS versus the parole. And so I'm going to turn back to Daniel to talk a little bit more about TPS and some of the more complicated pieces of that. Daniel, what is the current TPS designation for Afghanistan and what should happen at its conclusion?
Yes, so Afghanistan is designated for temporary protected status for a period through November 20th of this year. TPS provides lawful status and work authorization, kind of like we've talked about, for increments of up to 18 months for nationals of specific designated countries that are experiencing conflict, environmental disasters, or other extraordinary conditions. And in that context, Afghanistan was designated last spring for TPS for an 18-month period, which runs through November 20th. By law, Department of Homeland Security is supposed to review country conditions for designated countries and decide at least 60 days before the end date whether to extend the original designation, to redesignate, which would create a new designation for the same country to cover new individuals. USCRI and other organizations believe both are warranted because of current country conditions, and we're encouraging the administration to make that decision soon. Right now, we're working with other organizations such as the Afghan American Foundation, LIRS, another resettlement agency, on actively pushing that request. So we hope to hear about a new TPS designation soon, sooner rather than later, but no later than September 20th or 21st.
Okay, so Daniel, this is another area that I think becomes complicated, or is a new designation versus is an extended designation. What happens with a new or extended designation?
An extension would add more time to the existing designation. So it would offer another 6, 12, hopefully 18 months to people that are already covered by the original designation. So that's an additional amount of time for lawful status, for work authorization. What it would look like, an extension would be published in the Federal Register, which would contain information about the automatic extension of employment authorization that people got during that initial window. I know with other TPS populations, it becomes like a thing, right, to have the Federal Register notice as proof of employment, because it talks about how the EAD, the employment authorization document that you got under the original TPS designation, how it's effectively auto-renewed. So we're really looking toward that Federal Register notice this fall. A redesignation is separate, but it's also critical because it establishes a new continuous residence, a new physical presence date for Afghans to be eligible for TPS. So it moves the cutoff date for when people can be eligible for TPS from the times that they currently are, which was last spring, to now this year.
Okay, so you basically answered it, but I feel like it's worth saying it again because this is a confusing part. Who would be served by an extension and a redesignation?
So the extension would cover folks who are already eligible for TPS through November 20th. It would provide that additional time for people who are already in the United States by the spring of 2022. Redesignation would set those new dates, so it would cover new individuals, new people who have arrived since then. They would be able to newly benefit from TPS. Particularly, you talk about those who have arrived during other relocation efforts, as well as those who have arrived at the southern border. We know that's a trend that resettlement offices are seeing of Afghans who have presented at the southern border in the last year or so. So those folks would also be eligible under a redesignation, but not an extension.
Okay, so that is a really critical distinction between those, and the reason why USCRI is pushing for that redesignation, so that people who have come in recently will be covered. So TPS, though, is obviously only temporary, and it has its limits. So why is it still viewed as an important protection?
Yes, so TPS, people might not apply for TPS for a variety of reasons. Obviously, in the name, it's temporary. TPS also doesn't necessarily confer the same access to benefits that parole has, including resettlement benefits. It's also it has to be renewed over and over again. But the one thing to kind of to remind ourselves on with TPS is it's enshrined in immigration law. It's already on the books. Whereas we're still fighting for AAA to be passed into law, TPS is already here. It's already a part of statute. It's also supposed to be insulated from outside influences in terms of DHS is supposed to consult, Department of Homeland Security is supposed to consult with the State Department, with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to review country conditions and then follow a very specific, like, technocratic process to reach a conclusion. So, and we believe that country conditions in Afghanistan over the last 18 months, over the last 2 years, are evident that Afghanistan continues to meet that threshold. So we really are optimistic that a TPS redesignation and extension will come down from this administration.
All right, thank you, Daniel. So we have a lot of questions in the chat, and I am going to try to start from the beginning when they first started coming in. I am going to reiterate what Jacob said because I'm afraid that some of these questions will border on providing individual legal advice. And so we'll try to do what we can as we go through. I know the ones at the beginning, though, a lot of them kind of are about the ins and outs of how things are working with the AAA. And so that's what I'm going to start with. And one of them is a straightforward question. Is there a financial provision to the AAA?
I would need to, I'm not sure what they mean specifically by financial provision in terms of it's been scored of its financial impact on the budget or whatnot. We do tend to view that in terms of a financial element to the AAA is that it does have we view that it would save the government an enormous amount of time and effort instead of processing asylum, SIV, reparole, TPS, that it would centralize thing in one adjustment of status process. Also, another way that question could be phrased potentially, adjustment of status under the AAA would be fee exempt. That's part of the bill provision. So that could be another thing that question could mean.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point to let folks know. And this one, I think, is just asking for your opinion. How hopeful are you that the AAA will be approved by this latest attempt?
We're hopeful because we're in a strong position. It has wide bipartisan support. I'm going to answer another question in the chat, which is how should we talk about this? Again, I think what your perspectives and experiences are. I think that's what staff and offices want to hear towards, but we really view this as a comprehensive answer to issues that have cropped up over the last 2 years. It's why it has such a wide base of support, from veterans groups to resettlement agencies, refugee and immigrant right groups, business associations, religious organizations. So it's a challenge. It's passing a immigration related bill in 2023. I think no one was under an illusion that it's easy. I personally believe December in the omnibus was the best chance that we've seen, but the NDAA and the new dynamics of additional co-sponsors provides another opportunity. So I remain hopeful, and I think we all do, as we continue to take meetings and continue to identify with offices on a very like personable level, when it's particularly 2 years after the events of August 2021. Offices kind of recognize how this is an urgent thing, and we see that across the spectrum when we meet with folks.
Okay, thank you. So this next one, Jacob, is for you, and you did answer this when in your presentation earlier, but I think that it is a little bit confusing and worth going over. And the question is that for current Afghan parolees who have their EADs, should they apply for renewal? And I know that you discussed the distinction. If you could just review that.
Sure, of course. So Afghan parolees who have parole status, it depends. It depends on if they've applied for any other form of relief. So those who have an asylum application pending or an adjustment of status application pending, they do not need to file on their own. USCIS will, on their own initiative, review those applications and decide whether the applicant merits a grant of reparole. If they haven't applied for either asylum or an adjustment of status, then that person would need to apply on their own initiative using Form I-131.
Perfect. Thank you. So we have a request to share a list of the congressional co-sponsors after the webinar, which I think we can definitely do. There is a question here, Daniel, about who the vocal opponents to the AAA are. Are there specific holdouts that we know of?
I will say, and this is publicly known, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa has repeatedly raised concerns. Generally, one of the things that we typically hear from offices is they're concerned about the vetting provisions, whether or not people have appropriately been screened and whatnot. That's kind of come up repeatedly, and is I will say a lot of the negotiations that occurred in late 2022 secured additional Republican support. Senator Wicker of Mississippi and Senator Moran of Kansas specifically, got on because of additional efforts to kind of strengthen and make sure that the vetting concerns and the vetting language of the bill are as robust as they can be. Because at the end of the day, the status quo doesn't just doing nothing doesn't exactly resolve this issue of expiring paroles and people here on parole. Whereas, if you are concerned about vetting, the AAA is kind of the answer to that in terms of getting everyone through a single process and making sure it's done and over with. And so everyone can kind of move forward, both the government, Afghans themselves, obviously, the communities and partners, agencies that serve them, and so on.
Perfect, because I think that I am down to a question from Karen Ackerman, and I think that was the answer to it, about what you envision as a permanent path to citizenship, and that is the Afghan Adjustment Act, as you've just described, to replace this kind of patchwork of processes that we've been talking about.
I also think part of it has to do with, and maybe Jacob can chime in on this as an attorney, of like what's easier to file and prepare of like a 485, like an adjustment of status, versus everything that is required to successfully mount an affirmative asylum case or to meet the multi-step process of the special immigrant visa process. So again, we view like getting people funneled through an adjustment of status process in one location is much more efficient, and that's how it's different than the patchwork. I don't know, Jacob, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I mean, it does come down to a lot of times to resources, right? We're trying to serve a very large population, and we only have so many people who can assist. So, I mean, a re-parole application is going to be relatively quickly for us to be able to complete. Asylum applications do take weeks to compile. In order to get to adjustment of status, an adjustment of status piece comes at the end of an SIV process, right? So you have to go through chief of mission approval, submitting all those documents, obtaining the special immigrant visa, and then adjusting your status. It also comes after 1 year of residency of being granted asylum. So that piece is very far removed from the beginning stages of what we can do.
Okay, I don't think that I mentioned this. I think this is a good point from Sarah Moss, and I certainly think that we can do that. We probably already have wording that folks can use when they reach out to their representative, and we will share that. So I think this next question is a question about, what happens if an Afghan parolee's initial period of parole expires, but their application is pending in USCIS? What do they do if they haven't gotten a response yet?
Yeah, this is something that's on our minds too. What happens? It depends. Again, the attorney's favorite answer. Theoretically, not true in every case, but unlawful presence would start to accrue, and then you'd have to try and waive that going on in the immigration process. But again, it depends without getting too deep into the weeds. This is part of the reason why we continue asking USCIS for notices that the sua sponte review is ongoing for whoever it is ongoing for, be sent to the intended beneficiary, because we have anxiety about that, and we completely understand. We feel that through our clients in our face-to-face interactions on a daily basis. We hope that we don't find ourselves in that situation, but the only thing that we have to go on now is USCIS telling us that they're working as fast and as hard as they can to prevent that from happening.
All right, so we're actually about out of time. At USCRI, we do try to keep our webinars to 45 minutes so that we can concisely provide information and recognize that all of you may have another meeting at the top of the hour. I do want to pause here for a minute, though. I think that Daniel and Jacob can see some of the other questions in the chat. There are so many. I know we're not going to make it through all of them, but are there one or two that you have seen that you want to jump in with an answer for before we close out in the next few minutes?
There's one here, part of the process that I'd like to address here. The ending for someone who's granted re-parole either through their own initiative, right? The applicant's initiative, where they apply with the Form I-131. This is fee exempt. It comes with an application for a new employment authorization card. A new employment authorization decision would be mailed along with that. For those benefiting from USCIS's sua sponte review, the notice of decision will be mailed to them, and that will contain work authorization. Work authorizations incident to parole status, humanitarian parole status. So they don't need an EAD card in order to be able to work. You would use the updated I-94 form, record of arrival, with Customs and Border Protection. On their website, you can access that, but the notice of decision would also come with a paper version of the I-94 form. That form is what you can show to employers when they're verifying work eligibility on the I-9 form when you start employment. If they don't accept that, you may go to the Department of Justice and they will work with your employer in order to make sure that they do accept that. Those benefiting from the sua sponte review, they may also apply for an updated EAD card if they would like, post receipt of decision.
All right, thank you.
I will say that yes, we will share this recording both with the registrants and participants who signed up for this webinar. I believe it should also be available on USCRI's website. To answer an anonymous question from 6 minutes ago, yes, the AAA would be a separate amendment to the NDAA compared to other amendments that have gotten a lot of attention, like military healthcare, DEI training, et cetera. Additionally, there's a question about withdrawing an asylum application. I have a pending asylum application. If AAA is approved by then, can I withdraw my application? Again, because of the reasons we talked about, AAA, we hasn't been approved yet. Congress doesn't come back until September after their August recess. Even if it were passed expeditiously, there's still several months for the administration to actually roll out and actually carry out the law, implementation guidance, interim guidance, et cetera. So we continue to encourage folks to pursue the immigration relief that they have applied for or have considered applying for, regardless of where the AAA stands, whatever you may hear about it on social media or from other sources. It's important that if you have gone down the road of applying for different forms of relief, that you continue to do so. I don't know if Jay would, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that. I'm not an attorney, so.
I think that question is directed at that person's case, and I wouldn't be comfortable answering that specifically.
So what I will say now thank you, Jacob and Daniel, for sharing your knowledge about this and information with everyone. What I feel after this presentation is that 2 years later, we are still, even though we're feeling very positive about the AAA, we're still in a place where things are unknown. The immigration status and the legal situation for Afghans is still unknown. And I don't want to end on a negative note. So what I want to say is that we are going to, as Daniel said, follow up in an email to all the participants and registrants with a link to this webinar, and also other resources and things that we've referenced throughout, because we want people to participate and advocate and to have the knowledge so that they can talk about it and push the issues so that Afghans have more certainty and more permanent protection. So we want to encourage you to follow USCRI on social media like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram so that you can see our latest statements and posts and calls to action. And we also encourage you to join our policy and advocacy list so that you get our bi-weekly report. It usually has a main issue, and then it will have updates on different things that are going on. Specifically, we will provide updates as they come through on anything related to the AAA and other issues that are affecting Afghans. So I want to thank everyone who took the time out of their day to join us, and I hope that everyone has a good rest of your week. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.